Good afternoon, it's Joyful Hermit. Well, I'm really going in the flow of the order of the present moment with topics, and I still haven't done the one on confession, I must confess. But a viewer, left a comment about the struggle with suffering and how difficult it is to, I could understand the person, how difficult to find the meaning in the suffering and to persevere in it, to even know, to have the faith of entering into something that could risk having more suffering involved. I had talked about Padre Pio, and actually, that was a talk. I should have made my little list of things that I was going to talk about, because I think the video was on the church. It ended up being on the holiness of the church, but a big interlude entered in with my talking about Padre Pio and his fear of probably subconscious. Well, he knew suffering was going to happen. There would be more, what he was entering into. Plus, he loved being home too, but and the devil was very much involved also, blocking him from going to the monastery where he was supposed to be. He was a Capuchin after all. It was following the war, or his being dismissed from military service due to health issues. And finally, so I got way off topic on that, but it was because I'm potentially going to do something that I realized that thing of Padre Pio came into my life, into my mind, from the Holy Spirit. And I've been having lots of demonic issues going on because potentially what I'm going to do can bring more suffering to me because of the wounds of the past. Wounds of the past. And that's what this viewer was mentioning, that the wounds are so deep. We can forgive other people and try to move on, but even the scars can seem like they will tear open again. And the human mind, with pain and suffering, and especially things that traumatize, it's part of PTSD. And you can have therapy or whatever, and still it may seem as if we're not healed at all. And we continue seeking to be healed, but we haven't found that right Band-Aid, I guess, or that right medicine for it. I had mentioned my godmother yesterday, how I think I was dependent upon her very much. Finally, someone who seemed to understand my bizarre spiritual life. And well, in fact, Catholicism. God led me into Catholicism in part because I found the mystics. And I'd mentioned before this book that my mother sent me, Enduring Grace, 7 Women Mystics, it's called. It was a paperback she sent me. And just out of the blue, she thought of me, I guess. And I hadn't used the word mystic. I had told her, I'd found out by then that I was very different, but I didn't know I was a mystic for sure, not at all. But when I read that book, what I did discover is those women, and she probably sent it because it didn't have saint in front of their names. If it had been definitively Catholic, she wouldn't have sent it. But she'd gotten it at a bookstore in Tubac, Arizona. And it was written by someone who was, I would have to say, very evolved, and viewed these women as women and mystics, and not strictly as in a certain religious category or even Christian. They were obviously, but it was a more generalized approach. And but as I read it, I recognized, because I had already read Teresa of Avila, one book of hers, her life, her autobiography, and knew that these women were Catholic saints. And I think there might have been one that she would have converted, but she died before she did. She was a Jewish woman who was very involved in Catholicism. I can't think of the name right now. I've had another bad, higher level headache today. So I've been in bed. And it's depressing to me. It's strange. I've been dozing, and my physical therapist thinks maybe my going out of myself so much is due to not getting good enough sleep. So I'll check on that. But anyway, it's a suffering. It's a suffering to feel guilty about just going off. I was watching, I want Christopher to know, if he watches this, that I've been watching his fencing films. That he was editor and helped produce these films. He's a viewer. And because his films that he did 6 years or so ago of fencers and the art of fencing reminded him or connected with him regarding the video I did about the pickleball tips and sports aspects that help me with my spiritual life. And the fencing is helping me with my spiritual life also. Maybe even more so in a way. They're getting into, well, of course, the podcasts aren't finished yet. And the fencing documentary has separate parts to it. And I'm just enjoying them a little bit at a time. I'll let them soak in. But this latest one had to do with, they get to a point where they are no longer aware of what they're doing. They've gone to some other level, and they are existing in the art of fencing. And they have transcended consciousness practically. So I thought that was interesting. And I wish maybe that's part of what I'm doing. Going out, I just go out of myself. And the day is gone practically, and I haven't done things. I started out this morning with good intentions of getting more done, accomplished, but the fatigue or something takes over, the headache, or I don't know, I get on this bed, and as my neighbor said, there's something to be said about being comfortable, and that sort of takes over. But the suffering, I think, is what's behind it. It's the pain of the body that we go to some other level. It's an art. Suffering is an art form. But my godmother, she'd given me it's a little holy card, real old one, of Jesus. And I had this little frame already. This would have been in probably 1994 she gave this to me. It was before I was confirmed Catholic. Hadn't yet decided it. I talked with those sisters, two of the sisters, 3 sisters total, for probably 2.5 to 3 years. A good full 2 years before I contacted a priest. So I always keep this, but it's always on my nightstand. And I don't know why, just the look in his eyes, looking upward, but the exhaustion, that crown of thorns, that's where my headache is. It's a crown of thorns headache. And sometimes I try to think, oh no, it isn't really, but when my ecstasies began, I remember that morning. It was Labor Day, 2008, I think. Yes, it was 2008, September, end of August. And during Mass, during the consecration, just the pain around the crown of thorns pain came on me big time. But then I think, no. And then I realize it doesn't matter. It's in faith, in trust. This is for the person who wrote about her suffering. It doesn't matter what kind of suffering. You are suffering with Christ. Unite your sufferings with Christ. And have faith. Faith that the sufferings are worthwhile and purposeful. And you'll have to do this all the time. It will become second nature to you after a while. You will stop intellectualizing and think with your heart. But yet the intellect will always keep fighting with your heart. Not fighting with it, but vying for being known. Having that impact. Our mind and our heart don't fight against each other, but they do want to be experienced, each of them. The one doesn't want the other one to drown it out. In other words, our God wants us to be simultaneously aware. But in the spiritual life, it's best to think with the heart. Leave off the intellectualizing. Thomas Aquinas discovered that after years of heavy duty using the intellect with theology and writing. And then he had a mystical experience, just one. And that did it. He stopped writing. He said, all my words are as straw. Once we experience God with the heart, the intellect is put in a different place. Its significance is otherwise. The intellect then, with the will, is centered in the soul. But the intellect also includes the heart, the experiential embrace of thinking with love, having love take over, if that makes sense. If our mind can be a mind of love, then we will ease into the spiritual realm, and we will become more one with God in our intentions, even, and in our faith will grow in that regard then. And so I also today, it's just amazing how the Holy Spirit works with us. There was that message from this viewer, Julie, of her suffering and asking for prayer, traumas from earlier in life, and a fear of having more. It holds her back in life. The suffering does. The fear of more of it. And it touched me because that is exactly what I was talking. Well, maybe it was because I had talked about Padre Pio that it brought to mind for her own dilemma of being held back from things because of this not wanting more suffering, but yet in the head understanding the suffering and knowing we shouldn't be afraid of, shouldn't let it control us. However, it does. It can keep us from wanting to, and it did. Padre did a very great mystic and saint, held him back from going on. to San Giovanni Rotondo, his monastery where he was to be, and where he would face more. And I'm in the process of doing something that I'll talk about separately because I'm determined to keep this shorter. That I'm doing it for various reasons, but a big part of me doesn't want to, and the devil will get involved with us when we are uncertain and cast doubts for us, and also if it's something that traditionally helps us and will bring graces also. And like Padre Pio, it was his purpose, his mission was meant to be there at the monastery, to be an active priest there, and to have what God had planned unfold in his life unfold. So it generally works out. But I found this next that relates, I think, to this, most definitely to the suffering that we all have or will have in varying degrees. As I've already mentioned with victim souls, it can be primary, it can be secondary. Victim soul can be a temporary. Our sufferings can be at different levels and degrees and amounts and durations and types of sufferings. So everybody will suffer, and we never know when someone will, or at what point in life a trauma, that the suffering will become a trauma. It can be later on in life. My grandmother had traumas earlier, but then she had major, of a sort, rejection from her adult children when she was not quite 80. And she died maybe 5 months after. Broken heart. Broke her heart. And broke her will. And her joy. Her eyes went dead and wounded. And it was so much so she couldn't get over it. And it was probably time, and I've looked back at that time period, and I think my aunts and uncles, it was so out of character that no one would take her in. She had lived with them all, a lot of her later years. She would take care of the grandchildren, help out. She had had a rough life. Her husband had died, and she had 8 children. And in the Depression, he died right like a week before it began, before the crash. So it was very hard, very difficult for all of them. But the kids all wanted her at different times. She gave the house or sold it to one of her sons for his family, the house that her husband had built for her. And that was a security that, thank God, she had. And I mean that in a thank you, God, for that, for my grandmother and for my aunts and uncles when they were kids. But otherwise, it was a tremendous struggle. And it was a sudden death, too, that he had, my grandfather had. But they somehow, and I often have thought that it was, that God allowed the adult children to have no room in their ends for her, that it was her time to have a crucifixion that would take her on into heaven. That she endured very quietly, but I was close to her. I could see that the life had gone out of her, that the will. And my mother and another aunt my mother in particular got a very nice room in a nursing home, but it wasn't in the town. It was in a nearby, because they thought, well, she would like being with her church background people, because some of them felt a little sad that maybe 5 or 6 years prior, or more, she had wanted to stay in another state with one of her daughters that she was staying with, but had really wanted to enter that home that was connected with her church. I think Church of the Brethren it was. Out in California, there was nice, and she had a good friend there, and that she had met when she was out helping that aunt take care of children and house, while that aunt got her business going, and still had 2 sons at home. So she was a servant all her life to her children, doing good for them, and in turn then she had a place to stay and people to be around. She loved the grandchildren, loved doing it, and had a sister, older sister in our hometown, and people that she knew, or ladies' aid, but it got to the point then that where she was staying with her eldest son, his wife just couldn't take it anymore. She was starting to have a lot of gas and burping, and was 79 and a half by then, and she told her husband she couldn't have the mother there, and they had a teenage son. Evidently the wife was concerned and for something to do with the son and dealing with it and all, and things happen like that, and I don't even blame that aunt. Somehow I've started to view it. I thought, why didn't my mother, and before my mother died, she talked about it and how guilty she felt. And I said then, well, why didn't we have her? And my mother even said I should have taken the year off just to be with, to help her, because she was ailing. She was starting to fail health-wise. But I think God intended it to happen that way. We all are going to have our crucifixions in life, and how God will get us to detach and to let go, say, of what we're dependent on in life, so that we will meet death and be willing to go on. We'll let go. And like my children, one is communicating and seems to, we're friends, but I know my place now. I recognize, also with the help of some viewers who commented, that God was doing that so that I would focus solely on my life with Christ. And as soon as they said it, I knew it was true. So I know to keep the distance, which works well with this one who does want to have a relationship, but not close like we had been, not to the same degree. And they're too busy. I had to see that. They're busy. And God didn't want that. They were my only remaining attachments on earth. And God had to get them away. And so I saw this. This is by Pope Benedict. It's from his Salvi Spe, which means to have hope or something like that. The grace of hope, or the saving grace of hope, to that effect. And within this, what do they call it? When they write something of importance on a spiritual or religious matter, theological matter, and spiritual guidance. Oh, they have a special name. Like not Lumen Gentium is one. All the popes write them off and on. They'll write these. They're just so impressive. That too reminds me of just the brilliance of many of the clergy in the church. Their intellectual levels, their hearts combined with their intellects. Someone who ends up being the leader of a church in any church is usually very advanced in theology and in spiritual life. But with Catholicism, with all of the spiritual elements that are so strong in it, and the priests themselves have so much education to begin with, the equivalent of a doctorate, but they can go on and get doctorates. They have 4 years of undergrad, 3 years in seminary, or if they go to seminary after high school, it's usually 7 years then that they have of education. 4 and 3. And then they can go on and get a doctorate in theology or spiritual life or, different kinds of theologies. And so very, very, not all, but most of them do go on and get a little more training. Those that are particularly motivated to that or called by God to that will. And Pope Benedict, he was beaten up by the media. He was more traditional. But I really liked him a great deal. He was also a mystic and an excellent writer and person who thought with his heart. But some people thought, oh, well, he was so intelligent. That's Joseph Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger, took the name of Benedict XVI when he was a pope from, I think, 2005 until 2013. He's a rare one in history who resigned, who retired from it. And I think in part because of the media, he felt that he wasn't able to be for the church. It was dividing. I think it would have divided anyway into political factions of liberals and traditionalists. But he lived his last years, maybe about 80, didn't die that long ago, a few years is all, in prayer and in writing, doing more writing. But this was written, as Salvi Spe was written while he was a pope. And he's talking about hope, encyclical. They're called encyclicals. That's my head injury. It takes a while for a word to come sometimes. This is that encyclical. And then he gets into a section on suffering with it. And in this particular part of suffering, I think it's very wise and deeply meaningful, but also very practically truthful. We can try to limit suffering, to fight against it, but we cannot eliminate it. It is when we attempt to avoid suffering by withdrawing from anything that might involve hurt, when we try to spare ourselves the effort and pain of pursuing truth, love, and goodness, that we drift into a life of emptiness, in which there may be almost no pain, but the dark sensation of meaninglessness and abandonment is all the greater. My grandmother went into that abandonment. And I'm in right now, I think, I get tempted to some meaninglessness and sort of drifting into emptiness. Part of it's exhaustion with me from probably not good sleep, but the suffering is not, or it is not by sidestepping or fleeing from suffering that we are healed, but rather by our capacity for accepting the suffering, maturing through it, and finding meaning through union with Christ, who suffered with infinite love. And then he goes on, in that context, he quotes a martyr, a Vietnamese martyr, from 1857, Paul Le Bao Tin, which illustrates the transformation of suffering through the lower power of hope springing from faith. And Paul, this man named Paul by birth, writes and starts it out with, I, Paul, in chains for the name of Christ, wish to relate to you the trials besetting me daily. He writes about his time in captivity in essentially a torture chamber in Vietnam for being Christian. He's being persecuted and tormented for being Christian. He died in 1857. So he describes the prison. It's a true image of everlasting hell, cruel tortures of every kind, shackles, iron chains, manacles are added, hatred, vengeance, calumnies, obscene speech, quarrels, evil acts, swearing, curses, as well as anguish and grief. But the God who once freed 3 children from the fiery furnace, he's referring to Daniel, and the 3 young men, 3 boys that were in the fiery furnace and escaped. God freed them. That God is with me always. He has delivered me from these tribulations and made them sweet, for his mercy is forever. In the midst of these torments, which usually terrify others, I am, by the grace of God, full of joy and gladness, because I am not alone. Christ is with me. How am I to bear with the spectacle, as each day I see emperors, mandarins, and their retinue, blaspheming your holy name, O Lord? Where is your glory? As I see all this, I would, in the ardent love I have for you, prefer to be torn limb from limb and to die as a witness to your love. So, and then he goes on, O Lord, show your power, save me, sustain me, that in my infirmity your power may be shown and may be glorified before the nations. So, and he goes on, ending it, I write these things to you in order that your faith and mine may be united in the midst of this storm. I cast my anchor towards the throne of God, the anchor that is the lively hope in my heart. And then Pope Benedict goes on to write, this is a letter from hell. It lays bare all the horror of a concentration camp, where to the torments inflicted by tyrants upon their victims is added the outbreak of evil in the victims themselves, such as they in turn become further instruments of their persecutors' cruelty. This is indeed a letter from hell, but it also reveals the truth of the psalm text. If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I sink to the netherworld, you are there. If I say, surely the darkness shall hide me, and night shall be my light, for you, darkness itself is not dark, and night shines as the day. Darkness and light are the same. That's from Psalm 139. Also, Psalm 23. Christ descended into hell, and is therefore close to those who cast into it, transforming their darkness into light. Suffering and torment is still terrible and well nigh unbearable. Yet the star of hope has risen. The anchor of the heart reaches the very throne of God. Instead of evil being unleashed within man, the light shines victorious. Suffering without ceasing to be suffering becomes, despite everything, a hymn of praise. So, Julie and all of us, we're all going to suffer, and all of us who do, have more suffering than most, it's a matter of trying to keep hope and faith, staying with God.
I won't.
My little thing is just starting to speak. I never understand these things. It's like I think they have lives of their own, these old tech tools. But hope and faith, staying with God, knowing that what is keeping us back is our own succumbing to fear. But fear is the flip side of faith. So whenever we have fear of trying something new or some new way of finding healing, sometimes it means to walk into what we think will cause us more pain. Like the three, like Daniel and, or who was that? It's in the book of Daniel, the three young men. Daniel wasn't in the furnace. I can't. Belshazzar, Ishnab, and whatever. I don't know. Oh, goodness. Oh, I've got this going on. Hold on a second here. Okay. And God protected them, and they got out. But they were singing hymns in there, and the people, went to, I think it was Nebuchadnezzar, and said, oh, they're looking like they're gods in there, walking. They had transformed into these holy beings with light around them, and like angels walking. And the emperor let them go because they were freed, because it was incredible that they weren't just burning and screaming in fear. So we have to try to not let the fear overtake us and hinder us. But that's the problem. We become frozen. We become frozen, like Padre Pio in a way was stuck and not able to go on to the next step in his life, the next place that he was supposed to be. And it did mean more suffering for him, but also the fulfillment of his mission, which was glorious mission. Hard work for him. It was a lot of work. And he had to die to himself to do it. He was no longer himself in the confessional. And he had to take persecution from his fellow monks, some of them. And it would bother him just as much to have adulation or people fawning over the fact that he had these mystical graces. He didn't like that. He was very humble. He was holy. But I think what we have to do when we are called to suffering, and it's true for all of us, no matter how much suffering, but especially those who have a great deal of suffering, only God is going to see us through. And we innately know that. And we must cast ourselves to God. Cast our cares upon the Lord, and he shall sustain us. Become one with God. Our sufferings must become one with God's sufferings. And we lose, like the people fencing, and I'm sure pickleball players, any athlete, eventually gets to a point, especially if it's a sport that requires extreme focus and skill, such as fencing, or pickleball actually is very strategy game if it's played well. If it's not just banging the ball, hitting them harder and harder, or hitting the people, getting points like that, and more cheating. But if it's done with strategy of where you're going to place that ball at such speed that you're working at, we would come to a point where it's practically as if they are not aware anymore. The ability and the means of performing takes over, and that's how it can be with our suffering. That God in us will take over the suffering. And but we need to do as the three men in the fire. We need to remember to praise God and to cast ourselves upon God, to fear not, and to walk into the suffering, to embrace it, to carry the cross, to take that cross and go to the next place. And that takes a great deal of courage and faith, but also hope. And I have to admit that for myself, with what I'm proposing, which is taking me right into more in an sort of an existential way, but a link that will tie me, it so reminds, that's why the Holy Spirit put Padre Pio to mind. It's not at all on Padre Pio's level. It's not that I'm going to any physical place, but it is going to bind me, to seal me, to chain me to that which in a temporal sense, and as I mentioned, it's people often who are the ones that cause the sin. Well, that's who does cause it. It's not a glorious supernatural creation of Christ, his church, that causes us any harm. It's us sinners who do the harm. And so I'm potentially just walking into it. And it's messing with me, because that's what hurt me more than anything, was that which I loved most, his Christ church. And I have to keep separating out that Christ church didn't hurt me. It was people in the church who I put so much idealization on, but people who I thought would be beyond reproach, beyond sin practically. Well, no, none of us are. And so Julie, or whoever else, but since Julie brought this up in her comment, those in your past, a mother or whomever it is, many people maybe, those that you think are supposed to protect us or tend us, be tender with us, or all guide us through life or be close, they're people and they sin too, and they don't mean to. And I'm sure she's forgiven. I've forgiven people, but still, on our part, it's hard to get re-involved or to go into another relationship or to trust or to have faith, have that kind of faith and hope that it won't happen again. Well, the thing is, it might. And even if it does, that's part of our human condition. And if we understand suffering from the standpoint that Pope Benedict was mentioning, and that I've had spiritual beings come to me and say, Teresa of Avila came from the other side to my clinical psychology class I was in, when I had volunteered to be a sub. I've never had done before, but I decided to. I was broken down because I'd just been told the day before by a specialist that I would never get better and I would have to learn to live a life of such suffering that I would never had dreamed to live a life like I was going to have to live, he said. a life you've never dreamed you'd have to live. And it shocked me to the core, upset me deeply. And because I was, pushing through trying to get another doctorate to be a clinical psychologist, and was really loved. That was my thing, my area, and I realized when I was in it, and could help people with pain and suffering and have an impact in the world and on people in that way, to help them with their suffering. Even though I knew I would have suffering, I just didn't know it was going to be so disabling. But it was, and I ended up having to drop that doctorate. There was no point. My pain just kept me from being able to meet with clients. And when they're in crisis, I was doing my intern hours. I was really whizzing through the courses. I was over half finished with that doctorate. And would have had the coursework finished in another 6 to 9 months at most. Because if you find what's your thing, it's easy. And we have to try to have our suffering be like that, second nature to us. And through praise of God, and just keep on suffering, let it lead. And view the suffering as Teresa of Avila, who came to that class, spoke through my voice to the class and answered questions. But at first she spoke mainly for me, but she did it through my voice because she wanted everyone in that room to hear. People who were going to be helping people. That suffering at other levels and dimensions is sheer joy and is as love. Suffering and love are intertwined. The more we suffer, the more we can love. The more we love, the more we can suffer. And the more we love something, we will suffer with that something. And that's why I suffered so when my little idealistic bubbles of the church were burst. My idealism was burst because I thought that everyone in the church would be striving at the same desire and having his body and blood in them. What would be, because I hadn't had yet, when I had that locution, lo and behold, by the power of this locution, your sufferings and the sufferings of Holy Mother Church shall be made one. I hadn't yet had Holy Communion yet, but I yearned for it. I went to Mass every day. I would go to Mass, couldn't receive yet. I hadn't become a member. I hadn't agreed yet in union with all. I hadn't learned all that was involved in the church. And so but I yearned to have his body and blood. The very first Mass I did go to, I felt a power coming from the front of that church, which later I realized was the tabernacle. And as a child, living like a block away, I could look through the back windows of our house and see this rounded out part that went up into a steeple. And when I became Catholic and went into that church and understood the tabernacle was in that rounded part, I was fascinated and drawn to it from a block and a half away as a child and wanted to paint pictures of that. Watercolors or something. It was, God was wooing me and preparing me for that step. But not everybody in the Catholic Church really can sense the spiritual and the numinous reality of taking Christ into them means to transform them. We are to be transformed and made holy. It's an assistance to make us holy in strength and faith. And it's a grace to be given, his body and his blood. And I've had communion in Protestant churches. There's no comparison if I think you're aware or sensitized or something. See, I didn't know until I sensed it before I had it. But I didn't know intellectually what it was or why I was sensing this something powerful and drawing up there, coming out and like drawing me in. And it was the consecrated hosts in the tabernacle. And so there is a power and a grace. But I don't think most Catholics themselves grasp that in a reality, the supernatural reality of the consecration as the mystic portal where they are shown into heaven at the altar. The priest, should be showing the people in the pews through the mystic portal at the time of consecration, not literally showing, but he stands at the portal. He is like the gatekeeper or something into the next world, into the supernatural and the mystical reality of heaven on earth and where we're going. So it's the stairway to heaven and all these imageries that we can say that represents our bodies, minds, hearts, and souls advancing into another realm, not of the temporal, not of earth anymore, but of heaven, even while we're on earth, of a union with God, a union with Christ. And that is the beauty of suffering, is that suffering helps. Suffering assists in that crossover. If we don't fight it, but I know it's so hard not to fight it because it hurts. It hurts. But as Pope Benedict mentions here, he talks about the maturing of it. I'm trying to get back into this and read that one section again. Oh, goodness sakes. My photos. Here we go. This is what I thought was powerful. We can try to limit suffering to fight against it, but we cannot eliminate it. It is when we attempt to avoid suffering by withdrawing from anything that might involve hurt, when we try to spare ourselves the effort and pain of pursuing truth, love, and goodness, that we drift into a life of emptiness, in which there may be almost no pain, but the dark sensation of meaninglessness and abandonment is all the greater. It is not by sidestepping or fleeing from suffering that we are healed, but rather we are healed by our capacity for accepting it, maturing through it, and finding meaning in suffering through union with Christ, who said with infinite love, or who suffered with infinite love. And that's what Teresa of Avila was expressing, that love and suffering at another level and dimension is sheer joy. Suffering is sheer joy at other levels and dimensions as it is one with love. It becomes intertwined with love. So pray about these things. And that's what I ultimately decided, was to take steps to do something that was going to make me inextricably linked, chained to that which, including the people who could, because they did in the past, cause me hurt, more pain, more anguish. I'm walking into it. I've had other considerations of a more supernatural aspect, an idealistic aspect also, I admit. I started thinking more with the heart of walking into something that would tie me to the church through a link, a chain, a cufflink. I would be handcuffed. I would be, even more than that, I'd be inextricably sealed. And that is to accept the canon law that the humans in the church created, but which has, I realize, has become de jure, meaning, the practice of the people. I could probably ask people in dioceses, how do I become a hermit? You have to be your bishop approves you, because they've read in their diocese newspapers and in the national newspapers, Catholics having their canonical approvals. That's the only thing I think they mostly know now. Whereas when I became a hermit, my spiritual da and myself, we hadn't heard of anything of that. So didn't know about that, what it was or anything. And even when the lady in England said, well, write to your diocese and ask for this. And I thought, well, what is that? That was after a year, or nearly a year, of my having begun the hermit life in 1999. And I didn't know what it was. And then my diocese started an investigation or whatever. I don't think they knew that much. And that bishop didn't. And he ended up later was going to canonically approve me, but then was retiring. So he said, well, wait for the next bishop. And then when that bishop, within 3 months, some young woman, a college girl, just had graduated, that I thought, oh no. And I felt spared. I really felt spared. And even 2 or 3 years ago, he did more that were not young, but other things that weren't, like, it's as if he doesn't know what hermit life is, what's necessary, that living alone, and like even today in here, feeling like I needed to get up and be doing things in here. I had plans, and instead I was just on this bed dozing off and on and distracting from pain. And that's another thing I have to face, that if I could get to the point of overcoming, because I'm in much more pain than I was 6 months ago even. So I've lost my capability of mind over my body. My intellect is no longer the power of the mind is no longer pushing me to keep going. And because it's more pain. Once I get into something, doing something, I can get my mind off. Or the other thing that can happen, like when I installed the water filter for a family member earlier in the week, getting down like that, my spinal headache just shot up. So it was more pain. But it felt good having done an act of charity and something useful. So it was sort of a counterbalanced with that. But then I had the pain to deal with for hours after, taking more of this ground aspirin and this is this BC stuff. If you need something that will help a headache, BC comes in a box that looks like a Band-Aid box. It's super strong aspirin and caffeine ground into a little white powder. And you take it in your mouth. You don't snort it, but it looks like the stuff they show on TV when you have cocaine users drawing those little piles of powder and stuff into their nostrils. So, but it does help with the headaches. I probably should have taken some much earlier today, but maybe I needed the time to read and to think about suffering and pray for Julie and other people who suffer, and for myself, and to keep getting a grip on what I have started the process for after it'll be 25 years in September that I started my hermit life. And the only thing I think that I don't have an annulment of my marriage. I can't get one because you have to have certain witnesses and all. See, this gets involved in all these laws and rules. Once you get one, then they have to have other dimensions around it of what. So with an annulment, you have to have someone who knew your spouse and you separately before you were married, and then have someone who knew you both while you were married and after, and they're dead. The people who would have known us together as we were courting, and I don't know anyone who knew him before. No contacts. His parents are deceased. Not that they wouldn't have cooperated, but I didn't know anyone else. He didn't really have, so it turned out, he had co-workers and things. I don't remember their names or where they would even be at this point. Many of them dead. He's older than me. I can't provide what would be necessary. But there is a provision in canon law that a bishop can dispense of restrictions for someone to enter into something that would otherwise be restricted to people who were not divorced and didn't have it annulled. And evidently, I assume this, but if it goes for naught, then I'll know for sure God didn't want it. But it would be that the bishop doesn't want to do that, the annulment thing, or the bypass that. But the canon lawyer, chancellor, I didn't think there was any problem with that. I think, I've been a hermit 25 years, but it's odd how that linkage with the church in that way of being tied, that really was a fear for me. It's, I think always before I felt like I could flee, that I had an escape route. That if things got too bad, I could leave. I could, and I'm not in parishes but I'm still, I'm confirmed a Catholic. And it was the love of my life. I mean, my children in a different sense, obviously. But the spiritual beauty. And there's no comparison of the graces and the depth and breadth of the spiritual life and what I have learned and grown. And then I in my conversion story, God literally brought me into the Catholic Church. Took 10 years. I kept resisting. But all kinds of spiritual and mystical experiences and intermingled with temporal things, And locutions, there's just, that was, he wanted me. This was my path, and this was my place I was to be. And I know that, but it's the suffering that occurred that I was not expecting. I had died and gone to heaven when I became Catholic. My little honeymoon period was brief, but it was glorious. And other parts of it were so stupendous in the temporal aspects, beyond compare, but the parts that were painful. And it was more painful the more I loved the church. The situation with my spiritual father, even being cold, being mistreated by the religious sisters who were left there, just not many were remaining alive. And in fact, I think they hired an administrator, unless they stopped calling themselves sisters or something. The woman I spoke to, worked out my plan of how I would get her to get them some heat. But it crushed me. All these things crush me. It's the sin that crushes me. But yet, I was duped by the devil, and still can be easily, in subtle ways. Grumpiness or nasty thoughts, of losing my equanimity of spirit within me, thinking of something like an HOA letter came yesterday. I saw, I thought, calm down, pray, you'll handle this like you did the other. Well, it was just a newsletter. It wasn't directed at me. So I think maybe my phone calls did it, but I've got to go. Anyway, hang in there, embrace the suffering. Do not fear. Keep going, keep going. Walk into that which you must do or ought to try to do, and don't fear suffering.